Hi, Matlodi. Everything fine? She will be here in a second. Hi, Matlodi.
5, 4. We are live on. Thank you all for joining us this morning in engaging in this critical session. Today marks a pivotal step in shaping B20 South Africa's 2025 agenda as Africa's first B20 presidency. You will be hearing from our B20 Sherpa, Kes Kovadia, as well as 3 of the task force chairs who are already very familiar to you in their professional capacity. Rueda Redfern is the chair of our Integrity and Compliance Task Force and CEO of Deloitte Africa. Sim Chabalala, chair of the Finance and Infrastructure Task Force and Group CEO of Standard Bank. And Ms. Busi Mabuza, chair of Trade and Investment Task Force and chair of the Industrial Development Corporation. This is not just a South African milestone, but Africa's moment to shape global economic policy. So why does this B20 matter? The G20 represents 85% of global GDP, 75% of trade, and 2/3 of the world's population. The B20 is the official business voice to the G20, crafting actionable policy recommendations for inclusive growth. South Africa's leadership as the only African G member since 1999 ensures Africa's priorities are heard. Therefore, what is our mandate? 8 task forces are developing evidence-based solutions on trade, energy, digital inclusion, climate, and more. These are focused on immeasurable impact, not just discussion. So, what is Africa's unique value? Africa is central to many of the global challenges. Issues of critical minerals, renewable energy, food security, and the world's youngest workforce that is emerging. We must shift the narrative from potential to progress, ensuring growth benefits all, not just the global north. Key priorities that Africa should be focusing on are 1, inclusive growth, advancing AfCFTA and regional value chains to unlock Africa's $3.4 trillion market, bridging economic divides in sub-Saharan Africa, where 400 million plus are in poverty, is going to demand urgent attention and action. The second is global collaboration. In a fragmented world, Africa can be a bridge balancing East-West tensions while securing supply chains. Public-private partnerships are critical to drive investment and stability. Thirdly, sustainability and innovation, leveraging Africa's renewable energy potential, such as solar, wind, and hydro, for a just energy transitions is going to be very, very important. Thus ensuring also digital inclusion to close the gap for SMEs and informal economies. And therefore, there is a real call to action. This is a collaborative effort. We need media to amplify Africa's voice and hold leaders accountable. The B20 Summit, which will be held in November 2025, is just the beginning. We are building a legacy of inclusive prosperity. Now, let us hear directly from our task force leaders about the work they are doing. And with that, let me hand over to Ms. Rueda Redfern. Over to you, Rueda.
Thank you. I'm just checking that we're not having any words from our Sherpa. Okay, let me start with my task force. So the task force that I am leading is the Integrity and Compliance Task Force. Perhaps let me start with a case for why integrity and compliance and why this task force in particular is really important. The Africa Union Advisory Board Against Corruption estimates that Africa loses up to $120 billion each year to corruption. Now, this is a particularly painful irony given that a large portion of these funds are borrowed from international lenders for development. Another view, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime Data suggests that corruption consumes nearly 25% of the continent's GDP annually. Now, these are staggering numbers, 25% of the continent's GDP annually. And while estimates and metrics may vary from the AU, the World Bank, or the African Development Bank, the message is the same. Corruption is a major impediment to economic growth in Africa. It stifles both domestic and foreign investment, as investors are deterred by these unpredictable legal frameworks, informal costs, and the risk of illicit demands. Funds that are meant for the development of infrastructure are diverted or reduced, which should be invested in building our logistics and transport networks. These funds should be invested in health facilities, education facilities, just by way of example of a few. On a micro level, it disproportionately affects the poor. And on a macro level, it weakens institutions and it weakens the rule of law, making it difficult to contract, to protect rights, and to ensure fair competition for businesses. In South Africa, we have well-known examples where corrupt private interests manipulated government policies for personal gain, diverting funds that were meant for development of sustainable projects in areas where jobs and infrastructure are much needed. And this is why this task force, the Integrity and Compliance Task Force, is so critical for us. It underpins the very economic and social environment that is needed for economic growth and therefore improvements to the lives of our citizens. So the Integrity and Compliance Task Force focuses on three key areas. The first area is encouraging the responsible use of technology in integrity and anti-corruption measures. The second area is to strengthen integrity and anti-corruption embedment in climate and sustainability finance systems. And then the third area is to amplify collective action and integrity standards for inclusive growth. Now, these three key areas are critical for South Africa's economic growth for a number of reasons, and I would like to touch on a few of these reasons. Corruption remains a critical barrier to inclusive development, distorting markets, undermining public trust, and compounding inequality. With the accelerating extreme weather events, economic volatility, and rapid digital transformation, the need for ethical, transparent, and cooperative governance is more urgent than ever. In South Africa, we are well aware of extreme weather events. Just look at what is happening and has been happening in the Eastern Cape and in KwaZulu-Natal. If funds that are meant for disaster recovery and climate resilient infrastructure are siphoned off, this leads to shoddy construction through corrupt tenders or corrupt contractors, resulting in the failure of infrastructure, putting lives in danger, and impacting the ability to do business and its resulting economic and community losses. New and complex risks have emerged at the intersection of environmental sustainability, technological change, and social justice. And without collective action to build inclusive and interoperable digital governance systems, these gaps threaten to widen inequality. These gaps threaten to limit access to opportunity and to erode the trust that is essential for global cooperation and shared prosperity. The B20 Integrity and Compliance Task Force advocates for integrity as the cornerstone of sustainable and inclusive growth. In an era of global instability, trust is a currency that no business, government, or society can afford to lose. The Integrity and Compliance Task Force believes that integrity should not be treated as a compliance checkbox, but as a core enabler of long-term economic resilience. And the B20 is advancing measures to embed corruption or to embed anti-corruption standards, transparency mechanisms, and ethical leadership into global business architectures, because credible governance is not optional. It is the foundation of everything that we seek to build. This year, our focus is on implementing the recommendations, and we are currently developing a number of pilots which may evolve into legacy initiatives, hopefully, and we hope that these legacy initiatives will be sustained by subsequent G20 presidencies. The Integrity and Compliance Task Force's recommendations strongly support South Africa's G20 presidency theme of solidarity, equality, sustainability, and its focus on tackling the global polycrisis through cooperative action. It is also aligned with B20 South Africa's guiding theme of inclusive growth and prosperity through global cooperation. So recommendation 1, which is encouraging the responsible use of technology in integrity and anti-corruption measures. This recommendation contributes to addressing the G20 key priorities of strengthening the public sector by promoting transparency, integrity, and accountability, and enhancing whistleblower protection mechanisms. The primary barrier to whistleblowing is the fear of retribution. And technology, through enhanced anonymity, significantly mitigates this fear, encouraging more individuals to come forward. The Association for Certified Fraud Examiners have found that whistleblowers are responsible for exposing a significantly higher percentage of fraud compared to audits, controls, or even law enforcement. And the desire to hold perpetrators accountable is a key motivator. In a Corruption Watch survey in South Africa, 73% of respondents had this as their main motivation. In other words, wanting to hold perpetrators accountable. This is the key motivation for 73% of respondents, and therefore legal protection and support is key to enable these whistleblowers to act. Our call for action is to promote the ethical and responsible use of technology and data tools in both public and private sectors, and to strengthen prevention and detection of corruption through innovative yet responsible technology. Recommendation 2, which again is to strengthen integrity and anti-corruption embedment in climate and sustainability finance systems. Now, this recommendation contributes to addressing the G20 South Africa's overarching theme of sustainability through encouraging responsible, transparent, and sustainable business practices across countries and sectors, working towards the goal of a better, more sustainable, and inclusive world for all. And then finally, our third recommendation, which is around amplifying collective action and integrity standards for inclusive growth. This recommendation on collective action and integrity standards emphasize the importance of solidarity between the public and private sectors, developed and developing economies, and large corporations and SMMEs. And by promoting multi-stakeholder partnerships and shared responsibility for integrity, we help build the trust that is essential for meaningful solidarity in addressing these global challenges. So this is an overview of the Integrity and Compliance Task Force and how the work that we are doing aligns with the work of the G20 as well. With that, let me hand over to Sim Shabalala, the Chair of the Finance and Infrastructure Task Force.
Thank you very much indeed, Rueda, and good morning, everyone. As Africans, one of the most important points that we want to make is that we are abundantly blessed with human, transitional, and the renewable resources required to drive the next wave of growth worldwide. Indeed, Africa contains very large reserves of the critical minerals necessary for the energy transition, including 55% of cobalt, 47% of manganese, and 22% of natural graphite. And of course, we also have excellent solar and wind resources. Africa, however, as Rueda has indicated, collects only about 40% of the revenue that could be generated by these resources. Now I ask you, how about if we got 60%? We need the right business environment, the appropriate social and environmental regulation, and the necessary infrastructure. In other words, our capacity to drive the world's growth depends to a large extent on our ability to maintain and expand our infrastructure. To use a South African example well known to everybody, we need to improve our rail and port infrastructure. According to data by the African Development Bank, Africa needs to spend about $170 billion a year to meet our infrastructure needs. At the moment, we are able to mobilize about half of the required amount, creating an African infrastructure funding gap of $85 billion. For Africa alone, for South Africa alone, that gap is $29 billion. For the world as a whole, it is roughly $500 billion. And so the core mandate of the Finance and Infrastructure Task Force is to work on ideas for the G20 and other key stakeholders to help close this massive infrastructure gap. To that end, we've developed ideas in three broad areas. Number one, ideas to support the expansion of investable infrastructure projects. Number two, thoughts about how to improve access to capital by increasing the availability, effectiveness, and resilience of public, private, and philanthropic investment. Number three, draft proposals about how to enhance the flow of funds between investors, infrastructure projects, and the wider community. Let me say a little bit more about a few of these. As we have worked to develop our draft proposals over the last few months, we focused on a combination of long-term policy proposals and short-term actions to drive meaningful change. As one example of a critical long-term reform, we would like to promote greater coordination and cooperation among infrastructure programs, both within and between countries. This involves prioritizing strategic sectors such as energy and digital infrastructure, sectors which hold the highest potential to impact economic growth and can act as catalysts for development in other areas. In the short term, we are focusing on project preparation and support. This includes encouraging a stronger emphasis on conducting robust feasibility studies and developing comprehensive business plans, as well as streamlining regulatory processes to reduce bureaucratic hurdles, ensuring that projects are better prepared and more likely to succeed. Another immediate priority is the need to carefully review prudential regulatory requirements. Currently, these requirements often impose disproportionately high risk weights on infrastructure investments. This discourages banks and insurers from allocating the necessary capital to these long-term projects. By advocating for a review of these requirements, whilst respecting the need for sensible safeguards, we aim to encourage more investment in infrastructure. Together, we believe that the ideas detailed in our forthcoming policy paper hold the potential to significantly enhance infrastructure project investability and coordination. This in turn will help us to attract billions in private and public capital, ensuring that the new developments effectively meet the infrastructure needs of our country, our continent, and the world. We have also developed a set of draft suggestions intended to address the fact that capital flows from infrastructure projects to the broader economy are often inefficient. This is both a missed opportunity for economic development and a source of additional risk to the viability and sustainability of projects. Here, our thoughts include improving access to tailored financing for smaller businesses and encouraging project developers to place a high priority on growing local technical capacity. None of these ideas are new. Rather, they've long been recognized as critical and urgent objectives. Our contribution is therefore to bring together the latest and, we hope, best thinking on these topics into a single paper of no more than 10,000 words. We have aimed to provide enough detail to enable the G20 to start thinking about practical reforms, but not so much that people drown in technical difficulties. As well as making sure that these draft proposals are up to date, practical and crisp, we have also worked hard to ensure that the ideas are aligned to the goals of South Africa's B20 and G20 and to the ongoing global policy conversation. The G20 has explicitly committed to inclusive and sustainable global growth. In our view, by supporting Africa's infrastructure development and that of other emerging and developing markets, we most effectively support global growth. An equally important consideration for us is that the theme of South Africa's B20, inclusive growth and prosperity through global cooperation, a goal that we have aimed to reflect throughout our paper. Talking of cooperation, I also want to commend the extremely efficient South Africa B20 Secretariat under the wise and effective leadership of the inimitable Kaz Kuvadia. Kaz and his team are making sure that there is a sensible division of labor between each task force and that our recommendations reinforce one another with minimum overlap and no contradictions. For instance, although both my task force and Rueda's talk about the value of reliable legal entity identifiers as a pathway to the formalization and the elimination of illegal activity, Rueda and her team lead us on this, and we follow. Similarly, although both Busi's and mine talk about blended finance, the finance and infrastructure paper outlines the bigger picture, whilst Busi's team apply that to trade finance in particular. It has been a singular and a great privilege to chair this task force. We have had so much support and input from business, multilateral institutions, and experts from every part of the G20, from across Africa and beyond. At last count, we had received more than 1,000 pieces of detailed written input from more than 200 individuals and organizations, from 34 nationalities, and from all the continents. The international policymaking machinery continues to function. Rationality and a bias towards cooperation continue to prevail at the international level. And it's been so good to see how South Africa stands in the international business community. Our calm, evidence-based, and inclusive style is warmly welcomed and appreciated by all the major international players. I submit that our task force has profoundly important messages about how business wants, firstly, to strengthen international cooperation, second, to build institutions and increase capabilities, and last and most important, to support faster and more inclusive growth. This work is undoubtedly the most powerful antidote to global fragmentation and volatility. With that, I hand you over to Sis Busi.
Sim, thank you so much for that leading input. I'm privileged, ladies and gentlemen, to chair the B20 South Africa Trade and Investment Task Force, which has over 200 members, led by a very strong panel of leadership, including our deputy chair as well as a number of co-chairs, drawn from across the G20 nations, as well as from across the African continent in recognition of the AU's membership of the G20. The mandate of the task force is to clearly amplify the voice of business by helping shape a collaborative, rules-based trade and investment environment that supports marginalized communities, as well as groups such as women, youth, and micro, small, and medium enterprises, and to create an environment that enables effective action against the impact of climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, for South Africa and the African continent, the challenges of growing protectionism, Africa's marginalization in the economic sphere, and climate change are not abstract, but are real. We depend on a predictable rules-based trade environment and investment flows to drive industrial development, to drive job creation, and long-term prosperity for our people. Noting that global trade is at a critical juncture, with recent policy shifts having heightened uncertainty, potentially undermining global economic growth, the task force has focused on calling for the promotion of stability in global trade by de-escalating the tariff crisis and through much-needed multilateral reform. The World Trade Organization estimates that new tariff actions and retaliations may reduce global trade by 0.2% or a staggering $50 billion. The weakened multilateral system with WTO negotiations paralyzed and non-functioning dispute settlement body lowers confidence in global trade, and this cripples trade. The task force has therefore focused on a recommendation that is designed to restore confidence in the system and provide greater certainty for cross-border trade through a number of actions that are going to be proposed to the G20. Secondly, the task force has focused on a call for the creation of a new trade and investment deal for Africa, a continent that we all know has such huge potential and yet remains at the margins, accounting for 3% of global FDI and a mere 3% of global trade, with a strong, very unfortunate reliance on low-value commodities. Despite significant progress made by injections such as AfCFTA, intracontinental trade remains at 17% in the African continent, comparing poorly to our other counterparts, such as Latin America, which has now achieved 22%. At the same time, this continent offers immense opportunity with a large endowment of critical minerals that Sim has already referred to, a youthful growing population, and an emerging integrated market underpinned by the AfCFTA. We believe that the recommendations and actions proposed by this task force will help increase African participation in the global economy, unlock demand, and build productive capacity to help the continent move beyond reliance on commodities. Ladies and gentlemen, trade, of course, contributes to climate change, but at the same time can offer potential solutions. The OECD estimates that trade is responsible for between 20 and 30% of global emissions, primarily through production and transport. Trade can also help scale up low-carbon technologies, strengthen resilience, and promote green growth. The task force has therefore focused on a recommendation that calls for the building of a climate-responsive trade and investment system. Although numerous instruments explored by our governments are well-intentioned, some solutions, such as border carbon adjustments, might inadvertently exclude low and medium income countries. that are most vulnerable to impacts of climate change, but have contributed the least to the impact of climate change. The task force has thankfully focused on this area and makes recommendations that will help avoid fragmentation, support just transition, and ensure that climate measures do not become new forms of exclusion for countries that need this the least. We are convinced that the work of the task force is strongly aligned to the B20's core priorities and reinforces the broader G20 agenda. As an example, our focus on a new trade and investment deal for Africa, a continent that has lagged our global peers, is important for inclusive growth. By advancing the implementation of the AfCFTA and expanding regional value chains, we believe that all of us can unlock Africa's $3.4 trillion opportunity, which is the market, a youthful market, and in this way foster conditions necessary for structural transformation. Through one of our other recommendations, we are pushing for a more stable, cooperative, multilateral trade system. This at a time when fragmentation is affecting all of us. Ladies and gentlemen, I now hand over to our Sherpa, Kes Kuvadia, to deal with the conclusion of our input.
Thank you very much, Busi. And thank you all for joining us in what is essentially a historic engagement. And it's a historic engagement because this is the first time South Africa and the continent is hosting the B20 and G20. And we don't do that again for at least 2 decades. So it is a golden opportunity and a historic engagement. Let me acknowledge particularly our task force chairs. We have been fortunate to pull together a group of chief executives from South Africa that are sterling examples of the leadership South Africa has to offer. And I'd like to thank them for their leadership in shaping Africa's global economic agenda and positioning it within the B20 B20 economic agenda. And let me also take this opportunity to thank particularly the communications element of the B20 Secretariat that have facilitated this interaction. Why does this matter? Why does the B20 matter? For the first time, as colleagues have said, we are leading the B20, G20 process in this country and on the continent. It gives us the opportunity to put the economic priorities of Africa onto the global map and into the basic heart of the G20 agenda. And we need to use that opportunity effectively. Task force chairs, as well as our co-chair, have talked about Africa's strengths, the critical minerals riches we have, the agricultural riches we have, the youth workforce we have. And these are all vital, not just to Africa's growth and development, but to the growth, development, and stability of the world. So we have an enormous responsibility as B20 South Africa, particularly in the current global environment that we face. Let me also just add that while we're representing South Africa and we're talking for Africa, we are also the 4th country in the global south that is hosting the B20 consecutively before we hand over to America at the end of this year. So we have a responsibility to prioritize the global south as well. We are absolutely clear as B20 South Africa that we need to make a commitment to our country, to the continent, and to the B20 to focus on inclusive growth that leads to prosperity, and that we do this in a collaborative and cooperating world. And this is not just about policy, although fundamentally the B20 is about policy development, but it's about real business action that drives change. And we are committed to ensure that the recommendations that come out of the B20 this year have implementable and actionable recommendations with clear suggestions to the G20 on who should be implementing and how that implementation happens, so that we have an impact and we make an impact. I'd also just like to recognize, given that we're talking to the media today, that we hold the media in very, very great importance. You are our partners, firstly, to hold us accountable, and secondly, to amplify Africa's voice, particularly in the economic sphere, given the B20, but also generally through the G20. And we must thank you for helping us shift the narrative as we build this story that we will build during the course of the year. So what are the plans going forward? This is our first media briefing, media roundtable, and we're having the media roundtable halfway through our hosting of the B20, because we now have a lot of work has happened. As you could hear, the task force chairs have indicated the general direction we're taking, and we can now continue to brief the public, to continue through the media, and brief other stakeholders about what's happening and how we move forward. And so there will be collaborations like these in future. The B20 summit happens from the 18th to the 20th of November, a few days before the G20 summit, which is on the 22nd and 23rd of November. The B20 summit will be in Johannesburg as a Centre Convention Center, and this is where recommendations will become real action, and we will actually demonstrate how we actually move forward in a real way. So let me conclude by expressing how grateful I am as a B20 Sherpa for your time, for your presence here, and for your interest in the B20. And we hand over to yourselves to actually ask us questions that we will surely respond to and hopefully add more value to this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you to our Sherpa, Cascavadia, our co-chair, and our task force chairs who joined us here today. I'm Esme Aronsa, and I represent the B20 Communications Desk. The questions have been coming in fast and furiously. Thank you so much for those of you who've sent it to our media mailbox, the B20 media mailbox. I've put a WhatsApp number in the chat, or you can send your number in the chat. If we don't get through any of the questions, we will definitely respond in writing within the hour or so. So please do keep your questions coming, and our chairs are available as and when when you need them to speak to your specific channel. So thank you for the interest, and once again, thank you for being here today. The first question, Cass and Busi, we're getting off hot and spicy, is what is the potential impact of the conflict between Iran and Israel on global trade? So Busi, I think let's let you start with a question and perhaps hand over to Cass.
And I'll leave the spicy bits to Cass. Thank you so much, Esme. So trade thrives in peaceful environments. Investment is attracted to stable, predictable environments. The task force and all business has continued to advocate for peace, not just in the Middle East, but in the African continent and across the world. This is what economies need to strive to thrive. And Cass, may I leave the geopolitics to you, please?
Thanks, Busi. Look, the situation in the Middle East currently is extremely problematic, not just for trade, not just for economic development and inclusive economic growth, but at a humanitarian level. And as Busi says, that trade and economic growth and development of markets, everything that feeds into inclusive economies, prosperity for people, needs a peaceful environment, needs collaboration between critical governments and critical players in the economy and in politics. And we need to encourage that sort of collaboration. We need to encourage a peaceful world, a world that recognizes that if we collaborate and work together, and we make certain compromises and sacrifices at all levels of society, that we can actually address the challenges of poverty, of unemployment, of lack of education, lack of skills, and we can all have a better world in which we all prosper and in which we all thrive. So certainly from the work we do, and the work that the B20 is currently doing, and we're obviously cognizant of the global environment, we would call on political leaders across the world, and particularly those currently involved in the current Middle Eastern conflict, to actually understand and recognize that we need that peaceful environment for growth and prosperity for all of our people. And to resolve these issues, we are happy to see that a temporary ceasefire has been called between Iran and Israel, and we hope that then extends to the entire Middle East in areas that there are still issues of violence and so on, and that we then move forward in that region in particular, but also as a globe, to grow this global economy to the benefit of all of our people.
Thank you so much, Cass. Another one that's come into the media mailbox is both the G20 and B20 are under African leadership this year. Is this just symbolic, or what would success look like in shaping long-term global norms for emerging markets specifically? Sim, can I give that one to you? Do you want to have a go at it?
Sure. Perhaps to look at it from the perspective of the Finance and Infrastructure Task Force. First of all, just to pick up the comments my colleagues made, the Rand last night was trading at roughly 1809. This morning it's at 1776. This is an unprecedented time of massive volatility, but it also tells us that it is a time where cool heads need to prevail. And for us to remember that this too shall pass. Thousands of years of economic history tell us that pursuant to volatility, the situation does revert to the status quo ante, to the mean. With that in mind, our institution, as has other institutions such as our rivals, the great rivals, First Rand, ABSA, Nedbank, Investec, I hope I've remembered all the great ones. All of us do scenario planning and we think about the worst. In fact, we're obliged to do that by the central bank. We plan for the worst and we hope for the best. And in that circumstance, we've done analyses of what would happen if trade wars continued to flare up, that tariffs went to a permanent rate of above 20%. And we've understood what that means for our businesses in the African continent. Likewise, if they were at about 10%. At about 10%, the impact is roughly 20 basis points on global GDP, on African GDP, and about 10 basis points on South African GDP. Now, a slowdown of that magnitude does impact companies, but it is not catastrophic for the entire economy. With that point in mind, we continue to believe that the continent will continue to grow at roughly 4%, notwithstanding all the volatility and the conflicts you're referring to. It'll grow at around 4% for the next decade or so. After roughly 2030, having grown at about 4%, it'll grow as the fastest growing region in the world, faster than Asia. Again, because of what my colleagues alluded to earlier, our continent is getting healthier, wealthier, more productive, more digitally connected, and is starting to take its rightful place in the control of its own resources. Just recently, in April 2023, the World Bank Africa Pulse report has a couple of paragraphs that speak to the nature of this opportunity for Africa. And the main point they make is that we need to take control as much as we can of the policies, the laws and the regulations that relate to the utilization of the rare earths as well as the critical minerals that we are beneficiaries of on the African continent. I made mention earlier of critical minerals generally, but in the case of South Africa, we have got rare earths. 2025 is a turning point for the African continent on rare earths. Countries like Malawi and a couple of other countries have discovered these rare earths, but we need to take charge of the governance, the laws, the regulations, the collection of the taxes, the manufacturing, the processing, because we actually can. If you just think about South Africa, and that's the last point, we have great universities. They lead the world in the engineering that is related to mining. Why can we not use the South African national competitive advantage in that context to make sure that not only do we dig up these minerals, but we process them as much as possible? Because after all, the rarity of these minerals is a combination of the minerals themselves, the laws, the regulations, and the supply chains, and we can do it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for bringing in that good overview of the potential, but also the progress that's possible. Let us move over to Ruwaida. Ruwaida, I've got a question for you that's come into the WhatsApp group. Why is collective action so important in the context of South Africa?
No, thank you, Esme. And collective action really is vital for South Africa because it really addresses multifaceted challenges like corruption and climate change, which really does require coordination, and it requires inclusive responses, from both the public sector, the private sector, and across the African continent, across the globe. I think, fundamental to our task force is the cost of corruption. And, as I said, corruption does remain a significant barrier to inclusive development. It distorts markets, it undermines public trust, and it exacerbates inequality. And so by working together through this collective action, businesses, government, and civil society can promote transparency, it can promote integrity and accountability, and really ensuring that resources are used effectively and that they are used equitably. And so, collective action is absolutely key, especially in this environment that we find ourselves in globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruwaida, for that. Some very important points. Mkhulisi or Cass, this is a question for you. South Africa's G20 presidency, as you've both said, is a historic first for Africa. What do you see as the most significant signal this sends about the continent's evolving role in global governance?
Go for it.
We, as Cass has indicated, this is a really unique opportunity for South Africa to really put the African continent really where it belongs on the map of the global stage. What is going to be very important for us to actually succeed going forward is going to require a new form of collaboration, and I want to come back to the collaboration part of how these recommendations, which by design are meant to create momentum from executing and action moving forward, that the recommendations and the way and we structure the nature and institutionalize this in a manner that from B20 to the B20, we can see progress on the recommendations that have been made. It would be very, very unfortunate, having spent all this effort and time with all these recommendations, that 2 years from now, we cannot account for what happened and where we are and how we have progressed. So in itself, it has to be a different mechanism of how we ensure that we hold each other accountable, and I say with each other, we hold not only those who have actually put forward these recommendations, because by and large, some of the recommendations have to be implemented within business sector itself, not just government. But we need to hold each other year on year to account. So we need a mechanism. And part of that, what we are trying to work on right now, is this what we call the Troika, where having learned and understood and when participated with the recommendations in Brazil, we are saying to ourselves, these recommendations that were there, how do we either look at the current geopolitics that are shaping and the implications that it has on multilateral organization, this geopolitics, to ensure that what was presented there, we are ensure that we can put certain KPIs now around those actions, and we continue because we feel that these recommendations actually make sense and they need time for them to be embedded. Okay, so now we need to find that mechanism, and it's going to require the collaboration of all the G20s and B20s to say, this mechanism is how we're going to actually ensure that we implement and we hold ourselves accountable. So this is a critical outcome that we need to solve for in this particular B20. And it will be the first time that that type of collaboration, which seeks to ensure that the actions and the commitments that we make are going to be sustained into the future. And so for me, that really presents a whole new opportunity around this collaboration. And so I'm very excited already to hear that amongst the various task forces that are taking place, this type of thinking, and also with the Sherpa, and also working with Brazil, we're already working with the US partners who are going to be taking over to say, let's sit together right now, and let's define how this can work going into the future. That will create success. Otherwise, it becomes a talk shop. For Africa, Africa needs to get itself sorted out in terms of really recognizing its true potential, and through the work that is there that needs to be undertaken through the AFCFTA. That is going to be the test for Africa. Because if we cannot get that part right, then we as a continent, if we cannot trade and open trade and really accelerate that drive to actually get this going, we will have failed our opportunity within the global stage, given the fact this is Africa's moment. So for me, there are key things that we need to get right, and we have to be honest with ourselves and actually call ourselves to action. That is why for us, even though as being the host of the B20, we said this is an African B20. And it's about also collaborating around Africa as being a dominant player.
Thank you so much, Mkhalisi. We have a question that's come to the mailbox. I would like to ask Busi Mabuza and Cas Kuvadia to please expand on the recommendation of a trade or investment deal for Africa. Ms. Mabuza spoke about the priority of getting a beneficial trade deal for the continent. Busi, do you want to address that, please?
Esme, thank you so much for that question. So a number of initiatives have actually, in the past, been proposed by G20 countries. And we are proposing, we have as one of our co-chairs, the Secretary General of the AFCFTA, which has helped us ensure that our conversations focus on the opportunity that the African continent presents in terms of ensuring that the African continental free trade area is actioned and facilitated by business. The policy mechanisms have been put in place. We now need business to step in and ensure that trade is actually facilitated in a manner that is meaningful and that unlocks the $3.4 trillion opportunity that this continent presents. So the task force is proposing, for example, the consolidation of all initiatives that have been put together in the past. The task force sees value in G20 member countries actually sending representatives to the AFCFTA office so that we ensure that trade is facilitated with G20 countries, but also in the process, the continent is supported in ensuring that intra-trade is stepped up in a meaningful fashion. Cas, may I hand over to you, please?
Yeah, thanks, Busi. If I could just add, and colleagues have talked about the strengths that Africa has, the riches it has. And let's be quite clear, African countries, Africa is not one country, it's a continent. And countries will and must compete with each other in responsible ways. But like other global economic conglomerates or global economic groups, I think there are certain issues that Africa needs to actually come together and negotiate. So to create an environment where we negotiate with global partners, with countries to the north, to ensure that we beneficiate the riches we have, to ensure that Africa benefits in a real way so that it adds value to the raw material it has, so that it actually plays a real role in ensuring the globe's food security, because it has the ability to do so. And we need certain rules that the global community needs to buy into for the entire continent, on the back of which different countries do different things and compete, and it's competition that's going to actually create these economies and allow the economies to grow. So I think that through organizations like the African Union, we need to begin to concentrate on those sorts of issues. We need to begin to have proper partnerships between government and the private sector and labor to ensure that each of us plays a role, but with the clear objective of allowing the continent to reach the full potential it has as soon as possible.
Thank you, Cass and Busi. Sim, I think there are a lot of questions coming in around the finance and infrastructure task team, but I think it kind of sums up people wanting to know a little bit more about the financing mechanisms that you could possibly be recommending for the continent going forward. Is there a little bit more detail you can give us around that?
Yes, at a high level, Esme, the recommendations or ideas that we are floating relate firstly to identifying the critical infrastructure on the African continent, and each of us has spoken about that, and then making recommendations that make it easier and faster to execute infrastructure on the continent. So there's a series of recommendations we make as far as that goes. Secondly, we make recommendations about closing the gap between the available finance globally and the shortage of that finance for the purposes of infrastructure on the continent. And I said the gap on the continent is roughly $85 billion, and for South Africa, it's roughly $30 billion. There are impediments to that, which relate to regulation, they relate to project preparation, they relate to the Africa Perception Risk Premium. Let me just touch on the Africa Perception Risk Premium quickly, because we make recommendations there that align with the cost of capital commission that has been floated by the G20. Our argument there is simply this, that the authorities, the fiscal authorities, need to get their act together, improve transparency, improve the quality of debt transparency, do investor relations, provide managers of money and ratings agencies with the information that they need to properly assess the riskiness or the country risks associated with the cost of capital. On the other hand, the ratings agencies need to be called to account. There's a gap between the fundamentals, the economic fundamentals, and the ratings that are attributed to particular countries. And there's a debate we're having. And in fact, ratings agencies are part of our task force. And there's a dialectical process on the go with them to get to grips with this. And lastly, we'll be making some recommendations that relate to the capital needed to be held by banks and insurers on the basis of the Basel rules, which unfairly penalize infrastructure and indeed development finance institutions. Because if they were appropriately rated, that would release more capital by insurance companies and banks to recycle capital into projects. And lastly, there's a series of recommendations we will be making to try and recycle money from these infrastructure projects into the economy, in particular to small to medium enterprises.
Folks, there you have it. We're at 10 o'clock. I think it's just time for me to close and thank the media colleagues for attending. You are so important in this B20, in this historic B20 here, to help us tell the narrative of B20 South Africa. Thank you for your interest, your engagement. Our chairs are always available for interviews, and I know you keep them busy. Our next media roundtable will be on the 30th of July, where you'll see some of the rest of the task force chairs and our leadership. Our other co-chair, Nonkululeko Nyembezi, is in China right now for World Economic Forum China. So we're engaging quite there. For the questions we didn't get to, you have our commitment that we will get them to you in writing. So thank you for sending them through. Good day, and thank you to our panel, to Rueda, who joined us remotely, and everyone in studio. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.